Hi everyone, thanks for coming out this afternoon. So we have two special speakers today, as you can see, one guest and one fellow Googler. Hal Varian, immediately to my right, is Google's chief economist and has worked with Google since 2002. Hal has contributed to Google projects on auction design, econometric analysis, finance, corporate strategy, and public policy. He's also an emeritus professor in business and economics and information management at the University of California, Berkeley. That's also where he earned his PhD. Before coming to Google, Hal taught at some of the world's most prestigious universities, including the University of Michigan, MIT, Oxford, Stanford, and, of course, Berkeley. Alvin Roth, our special guest, is the Craig and Susan McCaw Professor of Economics at Stanford University and the Gunn Professor of Economics and Business Administration Emeritus at Harvard. Professor Roth is an expert in game theory, experimental economics, and market design. In 2012, he and Lloyd S. Shapley were awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for their contributions to stable allocations and market design. And their work isn't just theory. It's been put to real-world use in areas ranging from healthcare to education, as Professor Roth discusses in his new book, which we're here to talk about today, Who Gets What and Why. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Hal Varian and Dr. Alvin Roth.
Welcome to the Hal and Al show. By the way, I didn't tell you, but since Jon Stewart's retired, there is an opening, and I thought maybe we could do a little rehearsal for that position. And one of us will be the interviewer, and one of us will be the guest. And
we'll figure out afterward.
We'll let the audience vote afterwards on which role is appropriate. But as you just heard, Al is here today because he wants to talk about his new book, Who Gets What and Why. And I have to say, it's a pretty broad title, right? You could say that's all of economics should exist at that time. So tell me what's unique about your book.
Well, it has a subtitle, which is The New Economics of Matchmaking and Market Design. And so I try to talk about matching markets and markets more broadly. A little bit, I think of it as a field guide to markets, the way you'd use a field guide to birds to let you know that there are more than red-breasted robins in the world. I think that outside of Silicon Valley, people have a very different view of markets than we have in the Valley. Because, of course, markets are ancient human artifacts, probably older than agriculture. But often we tend to think of markets the way we think of languages, which are also human artifacts, but which we can't intervene in very much. We speak English, but we speak it the way we received it, pretty much. But of course, companies like Google make markets. And there are a lot of market-making companies, and there are a lot of markets in the world. So markets, unlike languages, have proprietors, have interested, active groups of users, and are susceptible to design. We can change markets when they're not working the way we want, and we can invent new ones when we see markets that are missing.
And just to fill in a little for the audience, is this idea that you could design economic mechanisms like markets and like matching and other processes. That was, I guess, Leo Hurwitz is really the guy who first promulgated that, at least in current times.
I think that's right, although my guess is the guy who first promulgated it was trading in stone tools back before the beginning.
Yes. And a very interesting development in the last 10 or 15 years has been the development of algorithmic mechanism design, which is a way to combine computer science considerations like computability and so on with the economic considerations, which are incentives. And this has actually, I think, been very, very stimulating to both fields. And as an economist, you focused a lot on the incentive issues, but have you also dealt with the computational side of things, or is that?
Well, no, I have. One of the chapters in the book is devoted to kidney exchange, and as that market has developed, we're looking more and more at long chains and things that turn out to be computationally difficult problems. So they're NP-complete problems. They're also just hard, even though solvable, because you're dealing with integer programs that have more constraints than you can write down. So you have to generate them on the fly. And when you try calling things like Cplex, you run into memory problems. So you have to do column generation or row generation. So yes, we think a lot about the computational problems that arise in organizing some of the markets we deal with.
Yeah, it's been a very stimulating field for both sets of researchers. In fact, there's a conference, whole fall specialization at the Math Sciences Research Institute at Berkeley, which is devoted to exactly this topic, getting the computer engineers, computer scientists together, along with economists, to study a lot of these markets, both the theory of what can be done and what can be achieved, and the practice of actually implementing some of this stuff.
You know, as, again, I hardly have to say here, but as markets have moved more and more to the internet, the problem just of implementing them often falls to computer engineers of various sorts. And so there's going to be natural, inevitable contact between people who think of how the participants in a market will use it and the engineers who think how to make it happen on the internet.
So how did you get into this area? When you started, it was, there really weren't many people. I guess it was the original Gale-Shapley paper. The lot has subsequently been built on, but it wasn't, you know, it wasn't something that was in every curriculum the way it is now.
Well, I started by thinking about particular markets, and the first one that I studied for many years before I got an opportunity to redesign it was the market for new doctors in the United States. And that market had a lot of market failures prior to the 1950s when they invented a centralized clearinghouse that essentially anticipated the paper that Gale and Shapley wrote 10 years later. And over the years, they developed, that market worked very well for reasons that we now understand much better. But over the years, it developed problems because in the 1950s, when it began, it was a sort of simple market, simple in part because just about every graduate of an American medical school in 1950 was a man. But by 1970s, there were 10% women graduates, and today there are 50%. And so medical graduates started, one of the things they can do, they're very busy, one of the things they can do is marry each other. And they started looking for two jobs, not just for one. It turns out looking for two jobs is a theoretically and computationally more difficult problem than looking for one job. And so matching married couples to pairs of jobs became the question I was asked to help when I was asked to direct a redesign of that marketplace.
The grand challenge.
It was a challenge.
So why don't you outline, let's say, the Gale-Shapley example, just as a very simple case, a starting problem, so people can get an idea of what this matching process looks like, and then maybe say a word or two about how it can be extended to other cases.
Okay, well, Gale and Shapley wrote a prescient paper called College Admissions and the Stability of Marriage. So it had a funny title. And what they said is, they said, think of a problem of marriage where, they didn't quite put it this way, but supposing you're trying to organize a centralized clearinghouse to marry people, and you're not a central planner, you can't simply decide who marries whom. You can only make suggestions about who should marry whom. And what will ultimately determine who marries whom are the preferences of the married people, who each have the right to marry each other if they so choose. They said, what you would like to do then is you'd like to create a stable matching, if you could, which is a matching that has the property that there are no man and woman not married to each other who would both prefer to be married to each other. So your aim is to suggest a stable matching, because if you suggest an unstable matching, there'll be a blocking pair. There'll be a man and a woman not married to each other who would prefer to marry each other and who won't have to accept your suggestion. They could, instead of doing what you propose, they could marry each other.
So in other words, anybody that I would rather have wouldn't want me.
That's the characteristic of a stable matching.
Okay.
And they constructed an algorithm that produces a stable matching no matter what the preferences of the men and the women are. And there are two versions of the algorithm. One has the men proposing and one has the women proposing. And so the man proposing algorithm goes like this. At the first step of the algorithm, each man proposes to his first choice woman. And every woman who has received acceptable proposals, if you receive an unacceptable proposal, that is someone who you would rather not be married to, you'd rather be single, you reject them. But you also, if you've received multiple acceptable proposals, you hold on to the one you like best, the one you prefer the most, and reject the rest. But you don't immediately accept the proposal that you don't reject. This is a deferred acceptance algorithm. acceptance will only happen at the end. So what happens? All the men who have just been rejected, they propose to their next choice woman, their next most preferred woman. And every woman who's gotten a proposal now looks at the new proposals that she gets, together with any proposal that she may have held previously, keeps the one she likes best, rejects the rest. And this continues until no more rejections are issued, which it must do because it's a finite problem and no man proposes twice to the same woman. And when no more rejections are issued, then now the proposals are accepted and each woman is married to the man, if any, whose proposal she has not rejected. She might be holding on to one proposal. And what Gale and Shapley observed is that that matching, regardless of what the preferences were that were the inputs, is stable. It can't be that there are a man and a woman who would prefer each other to who they're matched to. And the reason, of course, is that if a man is matched to his third choice woman, he knows that his second choice woman doesn't prefer him because he already proposed to her and she rejected him when she got a proposal that she preferred. So that was where they left it. And later, when we started to think about this as centralized clearinghouses, we said, you know, this really depends on knowing the preferences, right, of the men and the women. And one of the things that you can show is that the men can do no better than to state their true preferences, but that the women's situation, when the men are proposing, is more complicated.
I think, isn't there a Jane Austen novel with that plot?
Several,
Something
I believe.
along that line,
Yes,
at
indeed.
least. I think I've encountered before, but Gale and Shapley, to my recollection, did not cite Jane Austen in that.
Well, they didn't deal with the incentive problem.
Yeah,
They took what for better or for worse, for many years became the computer science approach,
Right.
which is that the person organizing the market knows the preferences.
And many of you may know that a very common exercise in your first computer science or programming class is to write the code for this algorithm. So, but without looking at the incentives, that's one of the things. Before we talk about the incentives, give us a few more examples of where this two-sided matching market or multi-sided matching market might be relevant.
Well, so as I said, we've helped build clearinghouses for a variety of medical and healthcare marketplaces, but we're also, my colleagues and I are also helping reform school choice in a number of American cities. And you can easily have school choice mechanisms that don't work as well as a deferred acceptance algorithm clearinghouse. And so in recent years, we've helped redesign the processes for putting children into schools in New York and in Boston and New Orleans and in Denver and some other cities. And a clearinghouse that operates like a deferred acceptance algorithm solves a couple of problems that school choice systems often have. One is making it safe for children and their families to reveal their preferences to the school district. For many years, New York City, the way you applied for a school was you submitted a rank order list. This is my first choice, my second choice, my third choice. And then that list was Xeroxed and sent to the schools, and that was your application. What that meant was if I applied to your school, you might be able to see that I had applied and you were my third choice. And you could, as a school principal, you could adopt an admissions policy that says, we're a popular school, we're only going to admit people who list us as their first choice. So that would mean that although it appeared that I had lots of choices of schools, I might really have very few because of the schools I wanted, only the ones that I listed first would consider me. Similarly, Boston had a system of school choice where they tried to give as many people as possible their first choice, and when more people wanted a particular school as their first choice than they could fit in, they used a priority system to break ties. If an older sibling went to the same school, you could go. But the trouble with that mechanism, which was very benign in intent, they'd give as many people as possible their first choice, then as many people as possible their second choice, and so forth, was if you didn't get your first choice, your second choice might already have all its seats filled with people who had listed it as their first choice, so that even though you had high priority at your second choice, an older child who already went to the school, which means if you had listed it as your first choice, you would have gotten in. If you listed it as your second choice, you wouldn't. So when we use the deferred acceptance algorithm with students proposing, that solves that problem, because if you don't get into your first choice, when you apply to your second choice, they haven't filled all their seats yet. They've rejected some applications and kept others, but they haven't accepted those. And if you have very high priority at your second choice school, you go right to the top of their list and they reject someone else. So it's safe for you to tell the city what your choices are. Your chance of getting your second choice school, if you get rejected by your first choice, is just as large as it would have been if you had listed that school as your first choice.
And it's interesting, both of these examples, the school admission problem and the resident assignment problem, have this side constraint that it's good to have husband and wife in the same location. It's good to have older siblings and younger siblings in the same school, so the same complications presumably arise if you're trying to solve that full problem.
So not quite. In most cities, the school choice problem is simpler than the couples problem because we're dealing with older siblings who are already in place.
Okay.
Now, twins are a problem.
Yeah.
And in New Orleans, it's common for people to change schools at every grade. In most cities, you change schools at kindergarten, 6th grade, and 9th grade. So the couples problem for siblings isn't so bad. But in New Orleans, you might have a 1st and 3rd grader and you want to move them both to a different school. So they look like a couples problem.
So the stable marriage idea is very attractive, but it doesn't always exist. In the two-sided case, it exists. But tell us about the roommate problem.
Well, in the roommate problem and in the couples problem,
and
it
the
may not
couples,
exist.
yes, right.
But Gale-Shapley in their 62 paper, they said, you know, there's a big difference between defining what's a stable matching and knowing that one exists. And what the deferred acceptance algorithm allowed them to prove was that in two-sided matching, when you know who are the men and who are the women, who are the doctors and who are the hospitals, you can always find a stable matching. But they gave an example to show that it wouldn't always be so easy. And they said, think of the problem of matching roommates. So you have a bunch of people, any of whom can be a roommate with any other. This, incidentally, is a little bit like the problem we face with kidney exchange.
Okay.
But that's a different problem, and we face it in a different way. But what they said about roommates is, so your job is you're the housing office at some university, you get preferences for roommates, you have to fill double rooms. And consider the case of 4 people where person 1's first choice roommate is person 2, person 2's first choice roommate is person 3, person 3's first choice roommate is person 1, and everybody, person 1, 2, and 3, their last choice is person 4. And it turns out in this example, it's not going to matter what
He was my roommate in
Yes.
college. I remember him.
That's funny. He told me the same thing. But what you can see is there's no stable matching because whoever you match with person 4, that person, the person who is the roommate of person 4, is the first choice of someone else. And so whoever is roomed with person 4, together with whoever regards that person as his first choice, they're a blocking pair. They would both rather be rooming with each other than the matching that you've designed. So that shows that stable matchings might not always exist. And indeed, one of the first things I observed about the problem with couples was that when you have couples in the medical labor market, stable matchings might not always exist. And one of the differences between being an economic theorist and being a market designer was when I first observed this, I was still a game theorist, just observing the market, and it was enough for me to observe that therefore the problem of matching couples was a hard problem. And that made for a great paper, and full stop. So when one day my phone rang and on the other end was the director of the National Resident Matching Program, and he said, we're having these problems, would you redesign the match for us? I knew that it was no longer going to be enough to say that's a hard problem. It was going to become my hard problem. And so designing markets has changed my taste in economic theory, right, in much the way I think that it's going to change the taste of computer scientists in algorithmic theory.
It's like you proved the bumblebee couldn't fly. Now what?
Yeah.
But it's got to fly. Actually, another paper of yours that I handled when I was editor at the American Economic Review that really appealed to me was a sorority paper, right? Because there was a very explicit algorithm that was used to match sororities and pledges, but it had some really fundamental faults. Maybe you could say a word or two about that.
Well, so let me actually take that as an opportunity to talk about market failure, because one of the things marketplaces have to do for markets is make them thick. And one way you get markets to be thick is to agree on a time, hopefully an efficient time at which the marketplace could happen. But a lot of markets, and this happened with the medical market, they start to unravel. They go earlier and earlier. And it turns out that And today, if you know someone who's graduating from law school, they likely arrange their job perhaps 2 years in advance, particularly if they're going to clerk for an appellate judge or something like that. Well, it turns out sorority and fraternity recruiting is called rush for just this reason. It used to be that in the 1800s that sororities and fraternities were social clubs for college seniors. And then, in an effort to recruit more attractive candidates, some of the fraternities and sororities started to rush and recruit earlier. And today, of course, in colleges, sororities and fraternities recruit freshmen. They can hardly go any earlier. Although, at the beginning of the last century, when there was a lot less mobility about colleges, rush actually extended into high school years. You'd know who was coming to your college and you could rush them before they came. But different fraternities and sororities develop different ways of handling that. And the sororities have an organization that specifies, doesn't completely specify. Computer scientists would not be happy with the way they describe their algorithm because you can create events in which it's undefined. But they have an algorithm for recruiting. And it's an interesting algorithm, and it starts with parties of short duration that everyone is supposed to be invited to, and so you get invited to a first party. But then sororities can invite some young women back to a second party, and young women can't accept every invitation. They have a limit on how many they can go to, so there's information about preferences exchanged through parties, and then finally there's a matching algorithm. Preferences are submitted. And it has serious problems and has been heavily gamed. So when you study how sororities attract, it's been heavily gamed in part because universities and the Pan-Hellenic Council sometimes tries to allocate equally the number of pledges to sororities independent of their capacity. And that causes problems. It means that the outcomes that they try to enforce are unstable. There may be blocking pairs of young women in sororities who would like to be matched to each other and who could be matched to each other. So that changes the way sorority recruitment goes.
That was really a failure on the incentive side.
Yeah.
And
stability is related
to
incentives.
Yes,
Stability speaks to incentives to recontract or to go outside the system and get your match outside the official marketplace. So one of the things marketplaces have to do is they have to attract participants. They have to make the market thick.
So when I first came to Google back in 2002, I asked Eric Schmidt what I should work on. He says, why don't you take a look at this ad auction? I think it might make us a little money. And the ad auction had started in February of 2002, and I arrived in May of 2002, and looked at the ad auction. I was convinced, oh, this is so straightforward, it must be in the literature somewhere. And I looked through all the literature I could find on auctions and so on. And a year or two later, I discovered actually the basics were in your book, the Roth and Sotomayor book, which was a kind of compendium, everything that was known about the assignment problem and two-sided matching problems in that book. And there in the chapter on incentives, there was a description of a problem of assigning workers to jobs. And it turned out that problem was very similar to assigning advertisers to slots. There were little differences. In fact, it was a more general problem, as it turns out. But if you read that chapter creatively, you can see the connection to what happened with the Google ad auction. So there's some hidden connections that I think most people aren't aware of. You probably would have never guessed that would be.
If you read that chapter and you're Hal Varian, you can see the connection.
Well, it does require a little bit of insight to see the connection. And the first time I read it, I didn't see it, but after 2 or 3 times, I got it.
Well, when we wrote it in 1990, we surely weren't thinking about Google.
Yes. And there's lots more. I mean, if you think about it, if you look at the tech world, now that you're a West Coaster, there are lots and lots of applications. Matching up drivers with passengers is what Uber does. Matching up renters, short-term renters with rooms, as Airbnb does, and many, many other applications of that sort.
Right.
Lot of activity in this area. And again, I think they start with these basic, fundamental, simple algorithms, but then there are always these edge cases, and there are always the constraints and issues that arise on top of that that make things difficult and exciting.
Absolutely, and market design is about details.
Yeah.
But there are also some general principles, and as you say, these are matching markets, and that's a lot of people, maybe not here, but a lot of people think about, when they think about markets, think about commodity markets, markets in which you don't care who you're transacting with. When you buy shares of stock on the New York Stock Exchange, you don't care who you're buying from, and they don't care who they're selling to. But as you say, Airbnb is a matching market. You have to match a traveler with a host. And there are lots of markets where even when prices are important, they don't decide who gets what. The way I put it in the book is that matching markets are markets in which you can't simply choose what you want. You also have to be chosen.
And you look at Google, in a way, we're matching up people with questions with people with answers. I mean, they might be, maybe we give them the answers directly, maybe we send them to a site where they can find the answer. So we're doing questions and answers matching, and then we're also doing buyers and sellers on the ad side. There's a lot of interest these days emanating from Europe about multi-sided platforms, where they're talking not necessarily markets per se, but places where people can meet up. And this would include Facebook as an example, because you're matching you and your friends and potential friends and so on. Do you encounter that issue? I mean, were you talking more about platforms, which is an industrial organization sort of topic, as opposed to markets as narrowly construed?
Oh, good. Again, I think of markets
very
pretty broadly.
Yeah.
So absolutely, I think that the things we talk about, platforms, I talk in the book. I talk about things that are often thought about as platforms, like, for instance, credit cards.
Yeah.
And of course, well, credit cards and smartphone operating systems and things like that, right? So the same reason there were just a few credit cards is the reason why there were just a few smartphone operating systems, because you want an operating system that has a lot of apps, and the app developers want an operating system that has a lot of users.
Yes.
So that comes under, I think of it as being part and parcel of making a market thick.
Yeah, and when you think about Google, again, we've got the people with the questions and the answers, and we've also got the content generators, and so you want to look at the whole ecosystem and try to figure out, how can I develop a system that sort of satisfies all the parties involved. And of course, there are inevitably trade-offs. In fact, let me go back to the very simple stable marriage problem. You talked about the case where the men are doing the proposing, but hey, there's that other side. The women could do the proposing. So what's the difference between, you get the same outcome, different outcomes?
Well, in small markets, you get different outcomes, and the difference matters systematically. The men like better the outcome, the stable matching that results when men propose, and the women like better the outcome that results when women propose. Now, it turns out in large markets, or in markets with different numbers of people on each side, those differences go away pretty quickly. So when we look at most of the markets we deal with, the set of stable matchings is very small. So getting to so it turns out you can always get a stable matching in these two-sided markets, but there's a sense in which it's very hard. Having to get a stable matching pretty much determines the outcome in many of these markets.
So we talked about some of the existing players in this matching world, the Ubers and Airbnbs and others. Have you talked to any interesting startups that are not widely known yet? I know one. I'll tell you about mine, but I want to hear from you first.
Well, I've talked to some startups, but I also think about markets that might not lend themselves to startups that could use some help in matching. One of the startups I mentioned in the book is a company called Bandwidth X that's trying to match up travelers and their smartphones with unused Wi-Fi, so that this would be seamless as far as you were concerned. But sometimes your smartphone would connect to the Wi-Fi in my apartment while I'm here, things like that. And so the contract would be with with the cable provider, things like that. But among the matching markets I'm a little bit thinking about these days, as I read about refugee resettlement, it turns out refugee resettlement policies are a little bit like early days computer science. They don't always take account of people's preferences. So here in so mostly we're reading about refugees in Europe, in Calais trying to get to England. But here in the United States, we have a policy that we try to resettle people sort of broadly across the country, with the idea that helps assimilation and doesn't put too much of a burden on communities. But of course, once someone comes to the United States, they can get on a bus and go wherever they want. So it turns out that there's a thriving community of Somali immigrants in Maine, not because the main climate is a lot like Somalia, but because there's already a thriving community there.
Right.
And so people are prepared to give up the housing subsidies that we offer them in far places in order to go to the places they want to be. So I think that as we think about things like refugee resettlement, we have to think not just about individuals, but about communities and about what they would like.
There was a great story in the Wall Street Journal several years ago about Cambodian donut shops. It turned out that something like 25% or 30% of the donut shops in California are run by Cambodians. And it all started when one guy brought his brother over, and the brother had a son, and so they expanded into this industry. But the punchline of the argument was that Cambodians really didn't eat donuts,
Right.
which is maybe a good thing to do if you're running a donut shop, if you don't really like them.
But that's a common pattern
occurrence,
of
yeah.
immigration in the U.S. So
Yeah.
there are concentrations of Koreans in dry cleaning,
Yes.
of Indians in motels, and it has to do with coming over and having a cousin who will take care of you while you get settled, and in the course of taking care of you, you work in his business, and he tells you how to contact suppliers and how to deal with customers, and then you can set up.
Yep. Tell us a bit about your kidney exchange. I think that's a very exciting and interesting story.
So organ transplantation is a fascinating area, but it's also a critical healthcare need. Right now, there are 100,000 people in the United States on a waiting list for a deceased donor organ. So those of you who have California driver's licenses, if you look at your license, you might see whether there's a little pink dot on it or not, which will have to do with whether you registered to be a deceased organ donor when you got your driver's license. And you can still do that if it's not on your driver's license. There's a website at, I forget the name now, it's part of the California government website. donatelife.com, .gov.california. But there aren't enough deceased donor organs, and even if you all register, there aren't enough, because it's very hard to die in a way that makes your organs donatable.
Well, that's a relief.
Well, the transplantation is a funny subject. There's good news and bad news mixed in. So the bad news is there aren't enough donors. The good news is traffic fatalities in the United States have really dropped since we were young. But kidneys are unusual because you each have two kidneys, and if you're healthy, you can remain healthy with just one kidney. And that means that if you knew someone, if you love someone who is dying of kidney failure, you might be able to donate a kidney to them. And donating a kidney has two parts to it. First, you have to be healthy enough to donate a kidney, but second, your kidney has to match them. Not everyone can take everyone else's kidney. And often that second part fails, and that's where kidney exchange comes in. It could be that you love someone who needs a kidney and you're healthy enough to donate a kidney, but you can't donate it to them. And I'm in the same situation, but maybe you can donate a kidney to my patient and I can donate a kidney to your patient. And so that's a simple exchange. It doesn't involve any money because it turns out it's against the law to pay money for a kidney in the United States and almost everywhere in the world. The single exception being the Islamic Republic of Iran, where there's a cash market for kidneys, a monetary market for kidneys. But in the rest of the world, you can't buy a kidney, but you can exchange kidneys. There's an amendment to the National Organ Transplant Act that makes it clear that this is legal, although we had already started kidney exchange in the United States before that. And over the years, we've gone from simple exchanges, like the one I just described between two pairs, to very complicated exchanges that may involve long chains. And some of these are reported in newspapers, and you see sets of pictures that have 60 people in them or more, which means 30 donors and 30 transplants. So this is where the computationally difficult optimization problems come in. But so far, we're able to solve them. And kidney exchange in the United States has become a standard form of transplantation, still growing. About 10% of the living donor kidney transplants in the United States are now done through exchange. My computer science and economics colleagues and I have worked with a variety of exchanges and hospitals, and it's spreading around the world as well. So that's been a lot of fun.
So there is a constraint there, and it's different than the brother, sister, husband, wife kind of constraint. And I know you've thought about this issue of repugnance, that people are opposed to this idea. They find it distasteful that somebody might sell a body part or something like that.
And it's a felony in the United States.
A felony.
So the National Organ Transplant Act makes it a felony for you to sell me your kidney or for me to buy your kidney. So So I got interested in the question of repugnant transactions because, of course, there are 100,000 people waiting for kidneys in the United States. Thousands die each year. It's not that this is a costless wait. So it's interesting that everywhere in the world, just about, it's against the law to buy and sell kidneys. At the same time, there are black markets. There are people desperate to buy kidneys, and there are people willing to sell them. But black markets, in which you have to deal with criminals because they're against the law, black markets often work very, very badly. So they give few guarantees and little post-operative care to the donors, sellers, and things like that. But there's lively debate among surgeons and among patients and among other people about whether this is a good law or not. Without presuming to answer that question, I can't help but be impressed by noticing that this is something that's illegal just about everywhere. So I started to get interested in the question of what I call repugnant transactions, which are transactions that some people would like to engage in and other people think they shouldn't, even though those people may not directly be harmed by the transaction. So there are a lot of examples from the profound to the trivial. For instance, I just had lunch at Google cafeteria. And one thing I can tell you with confidence is they never serve horse meat, because it turns out it's against the law to serve horse meat for human consumption in California. And that's not an ancient cowboy law from the time when a horse was a man's best friend. That's the result of a 1998 referendum. It turns out there were sufficient petitions to get that on the ballot, and Californians voted for it. And of course, it's not because no one in California wants to eat horse meat. It's because some people in California do want to eat horse meat, and other people think they shouldn't. There's no law against eating cockroaches in California.
Or New York.
Or New York.
Yeah. Now, were you around? You know, the Harvard Faculty Club used to serve horse
It
meat
did.
when I visited there, and you could have it. It was put in place, as I remember, in World War
II.
One.
World War I, maybe.
I think it was World War One, because the horses were used in World War One.
Yeah.
And it was the beef was being sent to soldiers and so on, and so it was a patriotic measure. But Harvard being Harvard, it never took it off. So I think it was 1970, it was 60 years. For 60 years at least, you could eat horse meat at the Harvard Faculty Club. But I think even that's gone, these old traditions.
It is gone, and it's gone for, I don't know exactly why at the Harvard Faculty Club, but in fact, although it's only illegal in California, you can't eat horse meat anywhere in the United States. It's not illegal, but you can't get it. And the reason you can't get it is Congress on several occasions tried to pass a law against eating horse meat and failed, but you can't eat any meat in the United States unless it is graded grade A, fit for human consumption, by the US Department of Agriculture. And Congress for many years now has withheld funds for the Department of Agriculture to inspect horse meat. So there is no USDA grade A horse meat in the United States, although it would be perfectly legal for you to eat it.
Yeah.
But there are more profound kinds of repugnant transactions. Think about same-sex marriage. I think of that as a sort of prototypical repugnant transaction. Some people wanted to marry each other, and other people who weren't involved and weren't planning to necessarily marry themselves, other people thought they shouldn't. So a repugnant transaction. And in the last 12 years, we've gone from having that legal in no American state to being legal in every American state. So repugnance can change. But it's not that as we get more modern, old repugnances necessarily die away. There are things that used to be not so repugnant that are now repugnant. We used to sell slaves in the United States. We don't do that anymore. And the most common way of buying passage across the Atlantic Ocean to North America used to be to sell yourself into a 5-year contract of indentured servitude, of voluntary slavery for a fixed term. And we don't do that anymore. So there are things that used to be not so repugnant that we didn't do them that are now repugnant. There used to be things that were repugnant and are no longer. And it's possible that our understanding of how to elicit organ donations may start to be in flux. It's certainly a topic of lively conversation.
To change gears a little bit, there's another interesting market that's being developed now by some of your colleagues at Stanford. That's the incentive market for spectrum, where they're trying to get spectrum from TV stations to sell into the government as an intermediary, who then repackages that spectrum, moves the TV stations to different frequencies, and then sells the freed up spectrum to the mobile phone carriers. And this is a very big efficiency from this because there are stations, TV stations, that have very tiny audiences where the spectrum they're utilizing would be immensely more valuable from the point of view of mobile telephony and mobile data use. Have you been involved with that at all? Or you
Well,
looked into the
Paul
problem a little
Milgram
bit?
and some of my colleagues
Yeah.
are deeply involved in that, so I hear
Yes.
a lot about it. One of the important market design features that you mentioned in passing there has to do with the property rights. What is it that the television stations were given and that they own? And what the Federal Communications Commission decided is that what they had been given was a bandwidth, but not particular frequencies.
Right.
And so that means that when the FCC buys back some spectrum from some TV stations, they can then compactify the remaining TV stations so that the rest of the spectrum can be used efficiently in other ways.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting property rights decision that has this very nice consequence that we can make more efficient use of spectrum now. You could imagine that they would have decided that what the TV stations owned was the particular band on which they broadcast, and that would make it much harder to repurpose this spectrum. And of course, in the old days, TV stations were given their spectrum through political processes. They didn't bid for them. And they originally had analog spectrum, and then they were given different spectrum that was more suited to digital purposes. And many TV companies, therefore, broadcasting companies, now own both kinds of spectrum, even though they're only making active use of one.
Yeah, and also there's an interesting computational problem in doing that repacking because at one point people were somewhat skeptical that could be done in a time frame that was appropriate for this auctioning process, but it turns out there have been made great advances there, and doing the repacking of spectrum is now pretty straightforward.
Right. And a lot of this has to do with machine learning things. You know, so Kevin Leighton Brown is one of the people who is involved in this.
Yeah. We're going to be coming up at Google. We're quite interested in this 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, which is going to be coming available in the next few years, and it will be kind of Wi-Fi on steroids. So it's high frequency, you can pack a lot of data into it, but by the same token, it has very poor propagation policies. So the question is, what kind of market or what kind of, let's say, platform or arrangement is appropriate for utilizing that spectrum? Because it would be something that we could really increase wireless access quite dramatically at a much lower cost. Well, I've talked enough here. I'd like to take some questions from the audience. We have any questions out there for Al?
Or for Hal.
Or for Hal, yeah. It's only a little aspirated consonant away, so. Yeah.
I noticed that your degrees were in OR, and I wondered, how did you make the transition from OR to economics, and is that a natural transition? Obviously, game theory shows up there.
Okay, so how did I make the transition from OR to economics? I'll answer the question two ways, because in some moods I feel like I never transited, that I just stayed doing what I was doing, and the disciplinary boundaries shifted around me. So I did get my degree in operations research. I wanted to help make things work better. But the things that I was interested in were multi-user systems. So I started to study game theory. And it looked like game theory, when I got my PhD in 1974, it looked like game theory was going to thrive in operations research. But game theory in 1974 didn't yet have an engineering aspect to it. So it didn't initially thrive in operations research. It thrived in economics. So that's the part of the story that says, you know, I just stayed doing what I was doing, and now that we've developed an engineering part of game theory, the market design, it's something that crosses boundaries. When my colleagues and I teach a 3-quarter sequence in market design at Stanford, and our students come not just from economics, but also from the Department of Management Science and Engineering, which is where OR settled down, and from computer science and from the business school. So I think of market design as being something that is inherently multidisciplinary.
Thank you so much for coming. My question has to do with the kidney exchange. I read that many of those chains, especially the longer ones, require an altruistic first give in order for them to all fall in line.
Yep.
I was wondering if there's other markets that require like an amount of altruism, where that first person to say they don't have a preference or will give something in order to make the chain work.
Well, it's true that to do a non-simultaneous chain, we like to start with a non-directed donor, someone who doesn't have a patient who needs a kidney. That way, each patient-donor pair that gives a kidney first gets a kidney, so that if there's a break in the chain, it doesn't cause a disastrous outcome for some pair that's given a kidney but didn't get one. I think that when housing markets are either very hot or very cold, you often see chains in real estate. So in housing markets, let's think of housing markets that are very cold, so not something you guys in Silicon Valley know about. But when it's hard to sell a house contracts often have contingent agreements which say, I'm going to buy your house on condition that I can sell my house in a timely way for a certain amount. And then you wait and see whether I sell my house. And I might, of course, have an offer to buy my house from someone who needs to sell his house. So the chains form when someone, so that was the kind of market that we sold our house in Boston when we moved out here in 2012. And the chain is broken when someone moves out from California and has cash in their hand and doesn't need to sell a house. They've already sold their house. And indeed, we moved here from Boston and didn't need to sell a house. Now, in a very hot market, it can often work, it can sometimes work the other way. You say, before I sell my house, I want to find a house to buy, so I'm sure that I have a place to live because houses are going so quickly. And so someone who's selling their house here and moving to Boston doesn't need that, and they're the end of a chain or the beginning of a chain.
It's interesting, this point about having an altruist really helps in design. Another case where this happens is in matching grants. So I'm trying to raise money for some cause, and I say, well, for every dollar you give, I'll give $1. So I'll do this matching grant. I wrote a couple papers on this some time ago, but I dug into the history a little bit, and guess who came up with the market design of matching grants?
Peggy Guggenheim.
You're off by a few hundred years. It was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was the first market engineer because he came up, he's very proud of this. It's in his autobiography. You can read the chapter where he describes how he came up with this idea and how well it worked. So a lot of his projects were actually financed by this kind of matching. Question?
So clearly, employer-employee matching has been very successful in the medical industry. And I can imagine reasons why that is, like all residents, graduating at the same time of the year. Are there other markets that you think it could also work in, and what's blocking more, fields of employment from using similar systems?
Well, that's a good question. So there are certainly other markets, but they tend to have the same characteristics that you mentioned of the medical market, which is, first of all, lots of people are graduating at the same time. Second, they are all going into the same kind of job, right? So lots of MBA students graduate at the same time, but the set of employers who employ MBA students is much bigger than the set of employers who employ new medical graduates who are all, the employers are all residency programs, basically. So there are lots of two-sided matching markets that are having problems, and that might work well with centralized clearinghouse. But markets that are simply having problems don't necessarily lend themselves to redesign. Sometimes they're having problems because of conflicting interests in the parties. So there's some congestion in, for instance, college admissions in the United States, right? It's now pretty easy to file a lot of applications to college. And of course, college admissions are matching markets. They're not commodity markets. Stanford doesn't choose its freshman class by raising the tuition until supply equals demand. There are all these other market institutions. And Stanford probably doesn't have to worry too much if you apply to Stanford about how much you're interested, because a lot of people, everyone who applies to Stanford is at least potentially interested in going. But there are lots of American colleges and universities that have to think hard, not just about how much they like you, but about how much you like them. Will they be able to be successful in recruiting you? And there was a time, of course, when it was harder to apply to many colleges, before the Common App, say, where the mere fact that you had applied to them was a pretty strong indication of interest. And that has gone away a little bit. So I think there's some room to explore ways to help break that congestion. And one of the markets we've done that in is the market for new PhD economists. And the American Economic Association has developed a signaling mechanism where new PhD economists can apply to all the available jobs, and a Department of Economics that wants to hire an assistant professor can get 600 applications. And we go to these meetings in January where we interview people, but even a hard-working junior recruiting team can only interview 20 or 25 people. So what the American Economic Association now allows you to do is to send 2 signals of interest. The idea being that you can send lots of applications, but you can only send 2 signals. An employer who gets one of your signals should take a look again and think maybe they should interview you. And I have some colleagues at Stanford, Muriel Needley and Sue Lee, who did a study of a dating market, an online dating market of this sort. And dating markets are also congested. That is, people with attractive pictures and profiles might get more emails than they can answer, and people who aren't getting their emails answered might send more and more emails to more and more people so that there's less and less information. And so what they did is they had a dating site where they gave people 2 virtual roses a day. So you could send as many emails as you wanted, but only 2 of them could have roses attached. And what they observed is that messages with roses were more successful in leading to subsequent contacts than not. So I think a lot of markets can't really use the solution that the doctors have used, but still have to deal with problems of congestion and thickness in ways that the clearinghouse solves for the medical markets.
Okay, so I gave you a softball question at the beginning. I'll give you a hardball question now.
Hal will answer it.
As you were, yeah, okay, good. Either one of you. As you were describing the Gale-Shapley setup, I was thinking in my mind about how you can change the assumptions and how faulty the assumptions were in some ways. Like there's a barrier synchronization for marriage, or the fact that people know their own utility function for what a good match is. Just seem like faulty models. So I could ask, which of these you think is a better thing to follow, but I'll ask a harder question even, which is, mathematicians would identify a few problems like the Riemann hypothesis or the twin prime conjecture as the big unsolved problems. Computer scientists would say P equals NP. What would a person in your field in market design say are the biggest unsolved problems that could be framed mathematically?
That's a good question. I don't have a ready answer for it. And one reason I don't have a ready answer is I think of market design more as an engineering kind of thing than as a mathematical kind of thing. So when you think about what are the big unsolved problems, and let me go back to the beginning part of your question, maybe the softer ball part. You say each of our models has assumptions that may not be exactly right, and that's certainly true. Markets are complex. People have large strategy spaces. When we make models, we try to take a piece of the market that we think is the most important piece and model what's going on there and build something informed by that model. But you have to constantly be aware that all the things you left out may be impinging on the boundaries of your model. So when you prove a theorem, it's true forever. Pythagoras' theorem tells us about right triangles, ancient and modern, and here and in China. It really nails right triangles. But when you look at bridges, the Romans built some great bridges, so great that they're still standing. But when we build bridges today, we build them differently. And I don't know that we solved any particular outstanding problem on bridges, but over time we got better at building bridges because of all sorts of things, better materials, better designs. And the underlying physics is the same as it always was, but our bridges don't look like the Roman bridges. So I think the things we're building and the flaws in our models are things that some of those flaws are important and some are not. Now, that will change over time because markets are a little bit like bridges. When you build a bridge, people start to use it, and that changes the traffic patterns, and then you might need better roads and bigger bridges. And that's the way it is with markets. So we have a lot of marketplaces have a lot of problems. They have to make markets thick. They have to deal with congestion. They have to make things safe and simple and trustworthy. And how to do those in each case, these are all often outstanding problems, but they may have different solutions in different environments. So I don't think there is going to be a Riemann hypothesis, something so central that forever after people will be able to point to it, because as Hal already mentioned and as we discussed, some of the cool things about, say, Gale-Shapley's deferred acceptance algorithm no longer apply to the more complicated models that we're dealing with, even in things like medical matching when we start to have married couples, things like that. So again, I could put the question back to you. Maybe I'd understand better if you told me what engineering problems you think of having the status of the Riemann hypothesis. I think of engineering problems as being more incremental. Over time, we get to do things better, and that's good.
I think that's a great wrap up. Our time is up. Thanks so much for coming, Al.
Well, thank you. you.